Hello, I'm Jim Mustick at Iona University in New Rochelle, New York, and I'm happy to be talking today to D. Graham Burnett, professor of history at Princeton University and one of the leading voices in the national conversation around attention. Graham, welcome.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Good afternoon.
When we talk about attention, there's a danger in my mind that we think it is one thing when it is in fact several different things. And one of the dangers of that kind of focusing on attention that needs to be paid and optimized is that it crowds out all the other kinds of attentions that enrich our lives. So how do you define attention?
I love that opening image. I couldn't agree with you more. And I think that never has it been more important for us to open out and enrich our sense of all the different things attention can be and all the different things it can do for us. And the reason that's so important is that never has our attention, never have our attentional abilities come under such incredible pressure. Never have they been subject to a kind of organized assault in the way that we've seen over the last, say, 15 or 20 years. And I'm talking, of course, about the attention economy. Mm-hmm. And so, as we've seen over these last 15 or 20 years, the rise of a heavily financed, technologically sophisticated, and tactically astute economic project to turn your eyeballs, the movement of your mind and your heart, your ability to care, into cash money through social media, through the kind of advertising structures that undergird our online lives. That stuff has done us immense kind of damage in our ability to understand all the things our attention can do. It's a little like a monoculture. Mm-hmm. We are increasingly in a kind of it's a little bit like landing out there in Kansas or something and being like, oh, there's nothing but sort of corn and soybeans out here for as far as the eye can see. This isn't exactly what ecology is supposed to feel like. And our attention is a little like that. We are canalized, slipstreamed into a tracking and triggering form of attention that is the kind that lives in our screen devices. It's the kind that those systems elicit. It's the kind that those systems attempt to bring forth so that it can be auctioned off on the side to people who are the highest bidder at any given moment. And it's less a question of like getting our attention back from those systems, because the kind of attention that those systems want is not the best kind of attention that we have to give and share in the world. So it's much more, as you said, a question of remembering how diverse and expansive the range of attentional forms really are.
I want to ask you a little bit about attention and time, because it seems to me that kind of monocultural definition of attention treats attention the way in Zeno's famous paradox, motion is treated. That Achilles and the hare are running a race. The hare gets a head start. It's slower, but there's a certain logical approach to it that Zeno took, saying in order to catch up with the hare, Achilles has to get halfway there. In that time, the hare has moved forward, then he has to get halfway there again. So within that logical structure, Achilles can never, in fact, catch up. So Zeno argued, actually, motion is an illusion. But there's actually another way to look at it. Henri Bergson proposed the idea of the durée, that there's something that happens over time where it's not time is not just discrete moments. There's an experience of it that renders that purely logical view of it as false as it obviously is to our eyes when we would view a race like that. I think there's something like that going on with attention, where we want to make it instrumentalizable. We want to use it well, use every moment and be focused on something. But actually, there's such a richer experience beyond that. And I bring it up because in talking about the phone, it's not just the way we are led to certain things, it's the way things come to us in a news feed. It's there for a minute, then it's gone. Maybe you can find it again. So that our sense of time, as well as our sense of attention, is kind of distorted.
It's a really interesting, it's a really interesting overture, Jim. It's been such a pleasure to be on campus these last 2 days and to have a chance to talk about attention with a couple of the audiences here. And as you'll know, one of the things I've tried to emphasize in those talks is that as a historian of science, a lot of my research has focused on the scientific study of human attention in laboratories, largely in the 20th century, although reaching back into the 19th century. And that image of a kind of quantified attention, which you suggested might be thought of as analogous to the kind of paradox of the analytic of space in Zeno's paradox, that quantified conception of attention, behaviorist, tracking and triggering, that form of attention, I think I can show is largely conceptually a product of a very particular kind of research tradition. A research tradition that is anchored in laboratory practices in the United States in the 20th century, and anchored in a research tradition that's largely funded, to be honest, by what you might call the military-industrial complex. I mean, if you think about the kinds of attention that are at stake in that tracking and triggering, in those forms of vigilance that are at the heart of people in front of screens, those are the kinds of attention that are of interest to people who want to shoot down airplanes and keep people looking at radar screens for long periods of time. And so I think I can show that part of the reason we have this sort of sliced and diced attention that is sort of so easy to price now in these systems is because of a kind of contingent history of the research that has been done on the human attentional faculty across that period. And so your emphasis on time, temporality, on duration, which is so interesting, I do think is a nice way to get perpendicular to the plane in which all that work has been done. Because that is a kind of research project that has been interested in the objectification of our attentional capacities, has been interested, as I say, in the quantification of those capacities and in the instrumentalization of attention. When you reference Bergson and duration, you're invoking something much closer to the kind of phenomenological tradition within which we are wary of the move to externalize, objectify, render analytically apart from ourselves so that we can see the thing. And the skepticism that arises in the phenomenological tradition around that project is warranted. Because even if the kind of attention that could be identified in laboratories that involve tracking cursor stimuli and so forth is a real thing, which it is, it's never going to substitute for what we might call that first-person shooter perspective, the sort of what it's like to be you in the cockpit of consciousness, what it's like to experience the world as a conscious being endowed with a set of faculties that create certain kinds of relational experiences with what obtains. And so I think one of the moves we need now in order to, in a way, protect ourselves from the perils of this attention economy, this human fracking, and we can talk a little bit about that term in a second. What we need is to be reminded of that phenomenological experience and say to ourselves, okay, wait a second, I feel like I'm having a whole bunch of different interesting encounters as I scroll through my feed. But if I become aware of my body, if I become aware of my eyes and my hands, I'm realizing that I'm actually in a highly, reflexive loop that's immensely thin. And if I open my window and stick my head out and suddenly hear that kind of open sonic cacophony of the world and feel the wind on my face and the blinding brightness of any given sun-filled day, I'm reminded of what it's like to be a kind of being like me. And I don't need to rehearse all the ways it is to be a being like you, Jim, to remind our listeners that there is love and light and music and sound, and there is what it is to daydream and be absent-minded and to be bored. And all of those are, if you like, different kind of attentional states that are constitutive of consciousness and constitutive of our relationship with ourselves and others. And it is those that we need to kind of bring back, warm up, reanimate if we want to be reminded why it is that we can kind of feel pretty crappy after going down any given 3-hour TikTok hole. Right.
And there are other research traditions that are older than the one you described that brought us to this instrumentalized version of attention. For instance, as you know, we've talked about Iona, founded by the Christian Brothers, going back to St. Columba. There's a monastic tradition, which is its own kind of research into attention. There is reading and the culture of reading, which is its own form of research into attention, that is not as productized in our lives as the newer forms of attention are. And we're in danger of losing touch with those things because our attention is stunted by the way it is fracked, which I'd like you to explain a little bit more, your metaphor there, but also by how we then kind of just begin to assign value to our attention. That image of fracking, let's do just a second on that, and then I'm going to circle back on some of these other traditions of practice, these other habits, these other aspects of our kind of traditionary inheritance around questions of attention, like reading, like study, like contemplation, or even prayer. But let's do the fracking thing first. The attention economy sounds sort of sweet and exciting, maybe. Human fracking sounds a little different. And we prefer, I think, that image of human fracking because I think it speaks to something kind of true and harrowing. So let's remind ourselves what fracking itself is. Right? So petroleum fracking, relatively recently developed technique for getting access to petroleum hydrocarbon resources in the deep earth. Back in the old days, you could just sort of drill a hole in a few places and oil would come gushing up out because there were big pressurized zones of crude out there in the world. There aren't many of those left. I don't think there are any of those left, really. And fracking was developed to bring to the surface deep-lying, widely distributed petroleum, natural gas. And the technology that makes this newly possible involves pumping down into the earth high-pressure, high-volume detergent
which then drives up to the surface this dissolved slurry of hydrocarbons, and which then on the surface you separate into a kind of a toxic sludge, which is not so great for groundwater and other living things, and the monetizable oil and gas. So this is not especially terrific for the planet, we know. Side effects include tectonic disturbances as the layered rock architecture of the globe is destabilized by this kind of high-pressure assault. Now, when we talk about, that's petroleum fracking. Now let's talk about human fracking. Human fracking, attention fracking, is when our social media companies pump into our faces high volume, high pressure detergent in the form of low grade inflammatory content, precisely in order to get down deep into our beings, fracture the kind of deep structures of our commitments of care and the architecture of our beings, and force to the surface a monetizable spume of our attention, sometimes in the form of our rage or dismay or our loneliness and our hope. And that up on the surface slurry can then be auctioned off to the highest bidder in what we've come to understand is the relentless multi-trillion-dollar industry to turn our eyeballs into money in the form of advertising. So we know that these devices are powered by extremely fancy AI and well-capitalized and brilliant humans who are seeking to hold us on them for as long as possible, seeking to get us to look over here when we thought we wanted to do this other thing, because every moment of TOD, time on device, also, as you will know, the German word for death, but you can bracket that, is ROI, is return on investment. So we recognize everybody's right to make a living, and we want a decent pay for everybody's hard day of work. But fracking humans heedlessly and in unregulated ways, when we know it harms us, this is not good, and we need to figure out ways to resist. And so this is where you start to think about why it's interesting to dig in and go back and get some of these alternate histories of attention, because all of that stuff now is more than just a kind of an interesting story about a monk in the 6th century who spent a lot of time on an island somewhere off the coast of Ireland or something. No. All those characters become for us now in a new way our forefighters in this new urgent project of human reclamation, where we are attempting to resist the damage that is being done to us as individuals and as communities and our relations with ourselves and others and with the good earth by the frackers. Now, me and my collaborators, my friends, we call that project attention activism. And I would really love it if your listeners could kind of take that phrase into their hearts. Attention activism. We need now a movement of people, diverse, wide-ranging, committed to all kinds of different stuff, who understand that we have a shared fight, a kind of common enemy at this point to what is good in us and in others. And what attention activists work to do is to think about alternate modes and ways of being with our attention. So some of them like contemplative meditation and mindfulness. That's cool. Some of them might just like knitting, and that's cool too. Some of them might really be into bonsai trees and think it's like awesome to spend time like taking care of your bonsai and belong to a club of people who like hang out with the bonsais. Some people might be rock climbers or like have like a league soccer, group of older folks who still get together to, play soccer or tennis on the weekend. That counts too, because you are not being fracked by your social media when you are with your friends doing that kind of stuff. All of these things that we're already doing can now be slightly re-seen as valid and important, indeed as crucial strategies in the collective work of attention activism. We are none of us going to be able to resist the Goliath of $4 trillion worth of AI and potent venture capital and all the most brilliant programmers out there with fancy algorithms alone. It's not like you and your little screen time app are ever going to be able to like hold space against the power of what's in front of us. But together, joining hands, joining arms, and recognizing that we're in this together, solidarity, collective action, we're going to be able to push back against the frackers.
I want to get to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about the Friends of Attention and the Strother School that you're working with. But before we get there, to pick up on the points you just made, as you say, we're unable individually to fight back against that in a effective way. We need some kind of collective action, or collective consciousness, at least, of what the stakes of the situation are. And I'm struck, sitting here at Iona University, an institution of higher education, which is kind of nested in two other institutions, the tradition of St. Columba and the Christian Brothers and the Catholic Church. And it strikes me that institutions, be they educational, religious, legislative, any list of them, are really kind of collective attention spans that should hold ground against things like the slash and burn advance of the frackers. But we seem to have, and I'm interested in your thoughts, is it in part because of the very ubiquity of the fracking that the institutions seem to have lost any power to resist with a collective force?
Yeah, I love this question, and I think it's super interesting to think afresh about our institutions in attentional terms. And as we were discussing a little bit earlier today, this moment in which our attention comes to our consciousness in a new way, exactly because it's under this terrifying new financializing pressure. You know, it's like a little bit like that old Hegelian phrase, you know, the owl of Minerva flying at dusk. It's only now that our kind of attention is being exploited in these terrifying new ways, and we feel compromised in relation to our attentional lives, desperate in some cases, that we can suddenly see that we've been needing, using, working attentionally the whole way. And that creates a really exciting sort of dialectical situation where in one sense it's a little like the apocalypse, in another sense, if we pivot, we can kind of see something new, and in fact attention can become a political force in a really new way that's exciting and promising. And we've seen this kind of dynamic in other ways historically. Let's think about the environmental movement, right? Nobody in 1520 was talking about environmentalism because the environment as such wasn't even really a concept. You might have these woods, this tree, this forest that belonged to this duke. I mean, sure, and you might argue about who got to, pick up driftwood on this particular beach, or who had access to shooting this or that deer, but that wasn't like an environmental issue, because the notion of like an environment that contains us and that is a kind of a shared problematic of humanity, that only emerges when that collective environmental situation is suddenly imperiled, and you have that kind of silent spring moment and a recognition that we're kind of all in this together with a transformed global consciousness that makes a new kind of politics possible around conservation and protection of the climate and the geosphere and the biosphere. So I would argue we're at a similar situation with attention. Its situation is bad, but that very badness lets us see it afresh. Now, to go to your question, oh my heavens, that's absolutely right. What are institutions anyway, if not social as well as material vessels for the kind of choreography of intergenerational attentional commitments and practices to particular kinds of objects and to particular kinds of gatherings, sanctuaries for certain kinds of attentional relations. Well, that's interesting to think about a college or a university in those terms. I think it's even interesting to think about other kinds of institutional forms, including our political, legislative forms in those terms. So one would need to roll up one's sleeves and really think that through.
Yeah.
Certainly, these kind of rethinkings keep opening. We can even rethink aspects of ritual and collective ritual practice as sort of forms of attentional collective training and choreography. So this is the kind of work that can be done by kind of sociologists and anthropologists, and I have colleagues at Princeton and folks elsewhere who think a lot about this kind of stuff. But the clear and present danger is that if we are tricked into thinking that what our attention, open quote, is, close quote, is this narrow form of tracking and triggering a kind of screen vigilance and selection for a task, that instrumentalized thing, we are blinkered, blinded. Our vision is titanically narrowed, and we are inside a game that is always already against us in our full humanity. So the first move we got to make is bust out of that way of thinking about our attention. To do that, we want to go back and remember all the different kinds of attentional traditions and practices that preceded us in history, and go out to take a walk and recognize all the different forms of rich attentional intelligence that are operating in the world. I mean, Jim, one of the most fabulous emails we've gotten at the Strother School, where we do this kind of activist work in Brooklyn, and in the international coalition of the Friends of Attention, and your listeners can look both those things up online and send us an email and get involved. These institutions that are committed to attention activism, our doors are always open. We have stuff coming across the transom. Best email we ever got from a long-distance freight train engineer who said, I've been reading some of your stuff, and I just want to say, I think it's fabulous. Because as I sit often across an all-night shift in front of 385,000 tons of cargo in a 2.5 mile long train behind me, and I'm at the control, focusing all night in that cone of light that runs out the rails across America, I spend my time thinking about how crucial my attention is, because I'm responsible for the kinetic energy of this device as it caroms across this country. And I have my eyes on the monitors that let me see what's ahead. And I would never want the form of awareness that I've cultivated as I do this work to be, replaced by anything but a human doing this kind of work. And we thought to ourselves, wow, that's a kind of attentional life that harkens back to, those night watchmen up in the crow's nest of whaling vessels on the lookout in the, navies of the 19th century, and to other kinds of posts of outlook, but also is all about a kind of very modern and contemporary work environment and a very specific kind of modern technology. So you got to go back to history to find all the attentionality that was there to expand our kind of awareness of what's possible with our attention, and go out and do a little kind of ethnography of all the attentional forms that are right outside your door right now, wherever you are. If you just walk down that hall and begin looking, who's paying attention in what way? And what you'll probably notice pretty quickly is that a scarifying number of the people you encounter almost wherever you are looking at the palm of their hand. And that was not the case 10 years ago.
Yes.
It wasn't the case 20 years ago, so we know what's happening. We are being increasingly sucked into this narrow form of attention, which is incommensurable with our human dignity and with the fullness of our persons, and is anyway just turning us into money all the time in a pretty creeped out way.
What can you say as we wrap up here about the work you're doing. I'm interested in the last thing you said. How can people help themselves cultivate their attention as that freight train engineer does, so that the attention is central to them? And how can people, particularly students here in our educational institution and in classrooms, how can they be present in their lives? Because attention is a form of presence, and the more we can practice it in a not only intentional but receptive way, the more learning is going to happen. And so just in closing, talk a little bit about what, with the Friends of Attention, the Schroeder School, the things that you're thinking about and doing, and how our listeners can find out more.
Yeah, fabulous. We think of attention activism as having sort of three pillars. Attention activism, three pillars underneath it. And the first one is study, teaching and learning. So the first thing to do is just to raise your consciousness by reading up, getting interested.
There's a wonderful section of the Friends of Attention, friendsofattention.net.
Yeah,
I think,
exactly.
The site called The Attention Trove.
The Attention Trove, yeah. That's David Landis, who did an amazing job. One of the volunteers has been working with us for a long time, prof down at Duke. And he assembled this incredible repository of fabulous resources, all available online, open, free, everything from films to books and articles. So, just get going. Like, God, we got to get out there and learn some stuff, study up. So first pillar, study, teaching and learning. Second pillar, organizing, coalition building, find your people. Find your people. We say this again, find your people. So come find us at the Strother School, but there are other organizations and communities out there that are raising these questions to awareness, some of which do so explicitly, some of which may not yet even be speaking the language of attention activism, but are effectively doing a kind of attention activism. So attention activism, number one, study, teaching and learning. Number two, organizing, coalition building, find your friends. And then number three, and this is close to our hearts and should be close to the heart of anyone who cares about a college or university, sanctuary. We need to work to cultivate spaces, mobile, temporary, where they can be found, that are respite or protection from the relentlessness of the frackers. So we're pro phones. We're not saying throw out your phone. Sure, you want to do a digital detox, do that, but you don't have to. But you need to get together with your people and decide, okay, how are we going to gather? In this family, when are we going to put our phones aside? And let's decide that together. This isn't about getting angry at each other or making arbitrary rules. This is about trying to figure out why we would want to have a little time when we're not doing that, so we can have some other things happen. We all know how these devices can come between us and the ways we want to be with ourselves and with others. Sanctuary, sanctuary, sanctuary. We need to make, identify, cultivate sanctuaries. A classroom can be a kind of sanctuary, but you got to talk about why we're in this classroom together and what we want to happen in here and what we need to do and not do to make that happen. A family can be a kind of sanctuary, but it requires everybody getting it in together and deciding, well, what is the point of our being able to be to each other and with each other at certain times in certain kinds of ways. Museums and libraries, these are also sanctuary spaces, or spaces that have legacy traditions of protection from certain kinds of outside world distractions, and those become urgent in new ways. So we think in terms of those three pillars, and would invite your listeners to do the same. And then would just invite people to actually check us out. We do a ton of courses and free workshops, and that's a way to begin to think about this stuff with others. Because I want to underscore that one last time. You can't do this alone. You can't do this alone. You can't do this alone. And in fact, we live in a culture, a society in which there's been a kind of epidemic of loneliness, in which, despite the ways that these devices have brought us into new constellations of remote humans, they have also severed us from each other in powerful ways that we have all felt. And we are also living kind of still in the sort of tracer aftershocks of the pandemic, which severed us from each other in yet another set of ways. So this is about finding each other and recognizing that it's only arm in arm that we're going to be able to push back against the frackers.
Graham Burnett, thank you for your attention, your wisdom, and for sharing so much of both with us at Iona the past couple of days.
Such a pleasure. Thanks, Chip.